I'm a 24-year-old guy, and my relationship with my dad has always been a mess. It started when I was a teenager. He was one of those dads who never let up, always pushing me to get perfect grades, follow every rule, and be some ideal version of a son. There wasn't any room to mess up. Not in school, not at home, not even in how I talked back then. My dad had this way of keeping track of everything, like he was running a ledger in his head, and every time I slipped up, it was just another mark against me. Things got even worse after my mom died when I was 14. She had this long fight with cancer, and when she passed, it was like the glue that kept our family together just disappeared. Instead of grieving together, my dad kind of turned on me. He blamed me for not being there enough, for not supporting him during that time. I was just a kid back then, but that didn't seem to matter to him. It felt like I became the punching bag for all his grief and frustration. He'd always talk about how much it cost him to raise me. It started as little comments, jokes, I thought, back when I was younger. You know, school's not free, kid, or those soccer lessons cost a fortune. But as I got older, those comments turned more serious. He started keeping an actual list of everything he spent on me. We're talking about school fees, sports equipment, even random stuff like vacations we took as a family. He'd remind me how much he paid for those trips, like I was supposed to pay him back for going to Disney World when I was 10. It was ridiculous, but he meant every word. I moved out the second I could, right after high school. I got into a state college, worked nights at a bar, and managed to graduate without any debt. But between rent, books, and scraping by, there wasn't much left over. I'd saved just enough to stay afloat, but I wasn't exactly rolling in cash. After college, I landed a job at a nonprofit. It's work that matters to me, but the pay is, well, let's just say it's enough to cover rent and groceries. I'm still paying off student loans, and there's not a lot of extra at the end of the month. Then came the pandemic, and my dad's business tanked. He'd always run this small repair shop, but the lockdowns hit him hard, and his savings dried up faster than he expected. Suddenly, he's calling me up saying I owe him. Not just a little, but a full $30,000. He claims it's for all the money he spent raising me. He says he kept track of every penny, and now he wants me to pay him back, like I'm some kind of investment that didn't pay off. I tried to brush it off at first, thinking he'd just blow off steam and let it go. But he didn't. He kept calling, kept texting, kept reminding me that it's my duty as his son to support him now that he's struggling. He even brought it up during dinner one night, laying out this whole argument about how I owe him for giving me life. That was his exact phrase, giving you life. He said it like I was supposed to feel grateful, like I should just hand over whatever he asked for because he paid for my braces in middle school. I don't have $30,000. Honestly, I don't even have $3,000 lying around. My job barely covers the basics. But every time he calls, it's the same thing. He reminds me how much he sacrificed, how much he gave up for me, and how he's hurting now. And then there's the guilt. Because yeah, he did raise me, he paid for school, he kept a roof over my head, he bought me clothes and drove me to soccer practice. But I thought that's what parents were supposed to do, right? That's just part of the deal when you have a kid. He's relentless about it. Sometimes he calls me late at night, leaving voicemails about how I'm selfish for not helping him when he needs it. He talks about how he could lose his house if he doesn't get the money soon. It's starting to feel like a full-time job just keeping him at arm's length. I tried to explain that I don't have that kind of money, but he always finds a way to turn it back on me, saying that if I really cared, I'd find a way. He even made a comment about me selling my car, like selling my beaten-up old car would even make a dent in what he's asking for. What makes it worse is that I'm an only child. There's no one else he can turn to, no brother or sister to share the burden with. It's just me, and he's made sure I know that. He's the one who put it all on me, but he makes it sound like I'm the one abandoning him. It's messed up and I feel stuck. Part of me wants to help because he's my dad, and he's clearly struggling. But another part of me knows that giving him anything would just open the door to more demands, more pressure. I've spent so long trying to get out from under his thumb, and now it feels like he's trying to drag me back in. But this time, he's got a bill attached. So here I am, posting this because I don't know what else to do. I don't know how to get through to him without sounding like I'm just cutting him off completely. I don't want to seem like an ungrateful son, but I also don't want to go broke trying to meet some impossible standard he's set. Some people might say he's right, that I should be paying him back. Others might say he's being manipulative. But right now, all I know is that I can't keep going like this. I don't have $30,000, and I don't think I ever will. And the way things are going, I'm starting to wonder if it's worth trying to salvage this relationship at all. Update 1. So, I guess this is the update no one wanted, least of all me. My dad showed up at my apartment yesterday, completely unannounced. It was late in the afternoon, and I'd just finished a long shift. I wasn't expecting any visitors, let alone him, standing there with that look on his face. He'd driven over 2 hours from his place, so I knew this wasn't going to be just a casual chat. He insisted that we needed to talk about repayment right now, in person. I was caught off guard, but I let him in, thinking maybe I could finally get through to him. He sat down and jumped right into it, talking about how I needed to start paying back at least part of what he's owed. I tried to stay calm and keep things civil. I explained that I just don't have the money and that, with my job and student loans, I'm barely keeping my own head above water. That's when he snapped. He stood up, pacing around my tiny living room, ranting about how selfish I am. He claimed that I'm the reason he's in this financial mess, that he spent everything on me, my education, my clothes, all of it. He went on and on, listing sacrifices he'd made over the years. He said he didn't buy himself a new car when he could have, skipped vacations, and put all his money into making sure I had what I needed. He made it sound like I'd drained his bank account on purpose, like I'd taken all those things from him. I tried to get a word in, reminding him that I worked part-time all through high school and college. I paid for a lot of my own stuff, textbooks, gas, even some of my school fees. But he wasn't hearing it. He just got louder, saying I wouldn't have even made it to college without him, that I owed him my whole future. He kept getting closer, his voice echoing off the walls, and I realized my neighbors could probably hear everything. Sure enough, there was a knock at my door. One of my neighbors, an older lady from down the hall, asked if everything was okay. I forced a smile, told her it was just a family disagreement, and she gave me this skeptical look before heading back to her place. Meanwhile, my dad just kept going, like he hadn't even noticed. He gave me an ultimatum, $5,000 by the end of the month, or he'd cut me off completely. He said if I didn't come through, he'd tell the entire family how ungrateful I was, how I abandoned him when he needed me most. After that, he stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. I just stood there, staring at the closed door for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It didn't take long for the guilt to set in, but I knew deep down there was no way I could come up with $5,000 in a month, not without losing my apartment or skipping out on my student loan payments. I called up my best friend later that night. She was furious when she heard what happened. She told me to focus on taking care of myself, that my dad's demands were completely unreasonable. She even offered to help me look into my options if things got worse. That gave me some comfort, but I still felt like I needed to know for sure if there was any legal basis to what he was saying. So I spent a few hours researching online, trying to figure out if he had any right to demand money from me for raising me. Turns out he doesn't. There's no legal obligation for adult children to pay back their parents for childhood expenses, at least not in my state. But knowing that didn't stop the calls. After he left my apartment, my dad started blowing up my phone with text after text. Each one was a reminder about the $5,000, how time was running out, how I'd regret it if I didn't pay up. The messages got more and more hostile, filled with accusations about how I was abandoning him, letting him suffer when I could easily help him out. It was like a full-on pressure campaign, and I was the only target. I turned back to Reddit for support, posting about the situation and asking if anyone else had dealt with something like this. The responses were a mixed bag. Some people said they understood the pressure and the guilt, but most of them told me to stand my ground. They pointed out that my dad's behavior sounded manipulative, that he was trying to use guilt as a weapon to get what he wanted. Reading those replies helped me feel a little less alone, like maybe I wasn't just being a terrible son for not wanting to give in. But the stress from all of this started to take a toll. I couldn't sleep right, and I found myself losing focus at work, constantly checking my phone, dreading the next message from him. My boss even noticed I seemed off and suggested I take some time if I needed it, which just made me realize how much this whole thing was eating away at me. I decided to see a therapist, hoping they could give me some perspective on how to handle all of this. My first session was eye-opening. The therapist didn't mince words. They said my dad's behavior was emotionally abusive, plain and simple. They explained that parents aren't supposed to demand repayment for the basics of raising a child, and that his actions were crossing major boundaries. They advised me to think seriously about what kind of relationship I wanted with him, and whether it might be healthier to put some distance between us. By the end of that session, I was starting to think that going no contact might be my only option if he didn't stop. But that idea scared me more than I thought it would. Cutting off my dad completely felt like something you only did when there was no other choice, when things had gotten beyond repair. And yet, here I was, wondering if I'd reached that point already. For now, I haven't made any final decisions, but I know I can't keep living like this. If he keeps pushing, I might have to take that step. I'm not ready to give up on having some kind of relationship with him, but I'm also not willing to sacrifice my own future just to meet his impossible demands. It's like I'm standing on a line, and every time he calls, every new message, I feel myself leaning further away. I guess time will tell which way I end up falling. Update 2. After the chaos of my dad showing up at my place, things went quiet for about a week. No calls, no texts, nothing. It was almost eerie, like waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then, one morning, just as I was heading out to work, my phone rang. It was him. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something told me to pick up. He sounded different this time, soft-spoken, almost defeated. He apologized for the way he acted at my apartment and said he wanted to meet up and talk things out. He even suggested a coffee shop near my place, said he just wanted to make things right between us. For a second, I thought maybe this was the breakthrough I'd been hoping for. Maybe he'd finally realized how over the top his demands had been. We met up that afternoon, in a small cafe that always smells like fresh bread. He was already sitting at a table when I walked in, nursing a cup of black coffee. I ordered a coffee for myself and sat down across from him. At first, he kept the conversation light, asking how work was going, saying he missed talking with me. I could feel some of the tension lift, and I started to think this might actually be the first normal conversation we'd had in years. But after about 15 minutes, the real reason he called became clear. He brought up the debt again, only this time, he tried a different approach. He said he understood that I couldn't pay the full $30,000 right now, but he was willing to make a deal. He suggested I start making small monthly payments, even if it was just a few $100s a month. He called it a compromise, like he was doing me a favor by letting me pay in installments. I could feel the optimism drain right out of me. I told him as calmly as I could that I still couldn't afford to pay him anything. I barely had enough to cover my own bills, and I was trying to build some stability for myself. I asked him to please understand where I was coming from and to respect my decision, but he wouldn't let it go. His voice started to shake and his eyes welled up. He told me that he was in danger of losing the house, that he was desperate, and that without my help, he might end up on the street. He painted this picture of himself alone, struggling, with nowhere to go. For a second, I felt that old tug of sympathy, that pull to just give in and try to help him out. But then I thought about my own situation. Helping him would mean risking everything I'd worked for, my apartment, my independence. After a while, I told him I couldn't do it, that I had to focus on keeping my own head above water. He went quiet for a moment, then just nodded, but the hurt in his expression made it clear he wasn't happy with my answer. I thought that would be the end of it, but things were just getting started. A few days later, I started getting calls from relatives, mostly aunts and uncles I hadn't heard from in ages. They all seemed to have the same story. My dad had reached out to them, saying I was refusing to help him in his time of need, that I was turning my back on family. A few of them seemed genuinely concerned, asking if there was something they could do to help us work things out, but others weren't so understanding. I got an earful from one uncle about how I should do my duty as a son, and that family comes first, no matter what. It felt like my dad had launched a whole PR campaign against me, turning our private conflict into a family drama. It wasn't long before I had to block his number, just to get some peace. My therapist had warned me that this might happen, that when people like my dad feel cornered, they often try to rally others to their side. She said I needed to stay firm on my boundaries, that this wasn't about being a bad son, but about protecting myself from his manipulation. Blocking him gave me some temporary relief. The constant buzzing of my phone finally stopped, and I had a few days where I could think clearly for the first time in weeks. But the guilt crept in not long after. What if I was being too harsh? What if he really did end up homeless because I couldn't find a way to help him? Those thoughts kept me up at night, even though I knew I was doing what I had to do. I leaned on my friends during that time. They reminded me that I'd spent years making sacrifices just to get out on my own, that it wasn't my responsibility to fix my dad's mistakes. They pointed out that my dad's demands weren't about me, they were about his refusal to accept his own situation. It helped to hear that, even if it didn't make the guilt disappear completely. I kept updating Reddit through all this, and the responses were overwhelmingly supportive. A lot of people shared their own stories of parents who tried to manipulate them, some with eerily similar tactics. It was comforting to know I wasn't alone, that this wasn't just something I'd made up in my head. I started to think about how far I'd come since moving out. I'd been on my own for 6 years, working my way through college, finding a job, keeping a roof over my head. I realized that I'd been independent for a long time now, even if my dad had never really let me feel like I was. Before I blocked him completely, I decided to send him one last message. I wrote a long text, laying everything out as clearly as I could. I explained that I couldn't give him the money he wanted, not without putting myself at risk. I told him I hoped he could understand why I was doing this, that it wasn't because I didn't care but because I had to take care of myself first. I hit send, knowing that he might not see it the way I wanted him to. After that, I blocked his number, not knowing if or when I'd hear from him again. It felt like a line had been drawn, and there was no going back now. Update 3. After I blocked my dad's number, I thought maybe things would settle down. But that hope lasted about a week before I found out what he'd been up to. My cousin called me out of the blue, sounding pretty concerned. She told me that my dad had been telling everyone in the family that I'd completely abandoned him, left him out to dry, and refused to help while he struggled. According to him, I was the ungrateful son who couldn't even spare a few bucks for his dad in a time of need. It didn't take long for the fallout to hit me. A few aunts and uncles cut contact without saying a word. They'd always been distant, but now they were ignoring my texts and calls. I found out later through another cousin that they believed my dad's version of events. They'd bought into his story about me being some heartless son who couldn't be bothered to support his father. Not everyone turned on me, though. A few relatives reached out, wanting to hear my side. They were confused because what my dad was saying didn't match what they knew about me. I explained everything, how he'd shown up demanding money, the endless calls, the threats, and why I'd finally blocked him. Some of them were sympathetic and said they understood why I'd made the choices I did. But others just couldn't get past the idea that a son should help his father no matter what. The pressure from all of this started to pile up, and it hit me hard. One day at work, I was going through my emails, and I suddenly felt like I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened up, and my hands started to shake. I had to lock myself in the bathroom until I could calm down. My boss found out later and insisted I take a few days off to rest. That's when I realized just how much the stress was affecting me. Then, things got worse. My dad decided to take his campaign online. He posted this long, dramatic rant on Facebook, tagging half the family. He wrote about how I'd turned my back on him, how he'd sacrificed everything for me, and how now I was leaving him to fend for himself in his darkest hour. He framed it like some tragic story, with himself as the victim and me as the cold, ungrateful son who just didn't care. People started sharing the post, and soon enough, I was getting comments and messages from people I'd never even met, calling me out for being selfish. It was like my entire character was on trial and strangers were lining up to judge me. I tried to ignore it, but seeing my name dragged through the mud by people who didn't know the full story had hurt. At that point, I knew I needed legal advice. I booked a consultation with a lawyer to see if there was anything I could do about my dad's demands and the online harassment. The lawyer listened to everything, then told me straight up that I had no legal obligation to pay my dad back for raising me. He explained that parents can't demand repayment for things like childhood expenses or school fees unless there's some kind of written agreement, which there wasn't. He also suggested that, if my dad kept harassing me, I might want to consider filing a restraining order to keep him from contacting me directly. I hadn't seriously thought about a restraining order before that. It felt like such an extreme step. But after everything that had happened, I realized I might not have another choice if my dad kept pushing. I wasn't ready to make that decision right away, but I kept the lawyer's card in my wallet just in case. One of my cousins who'd been supportive offered me a place to crash if I needed to get away for a bit. It was a relief to know that I had somewhere safe to go if things escalated. I didn't take her up on it yet, but knowing I had an option made a huge difference. It felt like I had a little bit of control back in my life. That night, after a long talk with my therapist, I decided to go fully no contact. I blocked my dad on every social media platform and asked my close relatives not to share anything about me with him. My therapist helped me draft a letter to send to the rest of the family, explaining what had happened from my perspective. I tried to keep it clear and honest, without throwing too much blame around. I just wanted them to understand why I'd made the choices I had. The reactions to the letter were mixed. Some relatives finally came around, saying they didn't realize how bad things had gotten between my dad and me. A few even apologized for taking his side without asking for my version of events. But others stayed loyal to my dad, insisting that I should have done more for him. That family always comes first no matter what. It hurt to see those relationships fray, but at least I knew I'd done everything I could to explain myself. Then, just when I thought things might be calming down, my dad sent me one final email. It was long, filled with accusations about how I'd abandoned him, how I was letting him suffer, and how I'd regret this someday. He wrote that he'd never thought I'd turn out like this, that I was a disappointment. He didn't hold back, and every line felt like another punch. I didn't respond to that email. Instead, I logged out, turned off my notifications, and tried to focus on the people who'd stuck by me. My friends, the cousin who'd offered me a place to stay, the few relatives who saw through my dad's manipulation, they were my lifeline during all of this. I updated Reddit with everything that had happened, from the Facebook post to the lawyer's advice and the final email. The outpouring of support I got was incredible. People reminded me that setting boundaries wasn't the same as being cruel, and that my dad's actions were his responsibility, not mine. It helped me feel like I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. It's strange, but even with all the chaos, I feel like I'm finally seeing a light at the end of this tunnel. It's not over yet, but I'm starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, I'll come out of this stronger than I was before. Update 4. After everything that went down, blocking my dad and stepping back from the family drama felt like a weight had finally lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waking up to a barrage of texts and calls demanding money. It took some adjusting, but I started finding a new routine, one that didn't revolve around constant anxiety. Not long after I cut off contact, I got a call from a company I'd applied to months ago. They offered me a new job with better pay and benefits than my current role at the nonprofit. It was a solid step up, the kind of opportunity that could actually give me a little breathing room financially. It meant moving to a new neighborhood closer to the office, but with the pay bump, I could finally start thinking about building up some savings, maybe even putting something aside for emergencies. The new job felt like the fresh start I desperately needed. I put in my notice at the nonprofit, and while it was tough leaving behind a place where I'd made a lot of connections, I knew this was the right move. Before the job change, I also decided to clean up my online presence. I deleted my social media accounts temporarily. My dad's Facebook rant had made me feel way too exposed, and I figured it was better to lay low for a while until things cooled off. Right around that time, one of my aunts reached out to me. She was one of the relatives who had initially taken my dad's side. She asked if she could come by for a visit, and I was hesitant at first, but I agreed. When she showed up, she looked a lot more sympathetic than I'd seen her before. She apologized for jumping to conclusions and said she hadn't realized how out of hand things had gotten between me and my dad. She mentioned how it wasn't right for him to put all that pressure on me. It wasn't a full fix for the tension in the family, but it felt like a small step toward healing. Just when I thought I was starting to get a handle on things, I got another call, this time from my cousin. She told me that my dad had been hospitalized after having a minor heart issue. The news hit me like a truck. She said he was stable, but hearing that he'd ended up in the hospital made everything feel complicated again. I found myself stuck between wanting to rush to his side and remembering all the reasons I'd had to distance myself in the first place. I talked it over with my therapist, trying to make sense of what to do. She reminded me that I'd made the decision to set boundaries for a reason, and that visiting him out of guilt wouldn't help either of us in the long run. She told me to focus on what was best for my own well-being, and to remember that my dad's health scare didn't change the way he had treated me. But it wasn't just my own mind I had to contend with. The family pressure started up again almost immediately. Relatives called, saying that I should visit my dad, that it was my duty to be there for him now that he was unwell. Some of them seemed to think this was the perfect opportunity for a reconciliation. They kept talking about how life's too short for grudges, but they didn't seem to get that this wasn't just about a grudge. It was about protecting myself from more manipulation. After thinking it over, I made the difficult decision not to visit. I knew that if I showed up at that hospital, my dad would see it as a crack in the boundaries I'd set, a chance to start up with the demands all over again. I wasn't ready to open that door back up, so I stayed firm, even though it meant dealing with a lot of judgment from relatives who thought I was being heartless. While all this was happening, I kept focusing on my job transition. I accepted the new offer, started packing up my apartment, and made plans to move closer to the new office. It felt good to have something concrete to look forward to. The move wasn't easy. I had to budget carefully to cover the deposit and moving costs, but it felt like I was taking a big step toward finally being stable. I heard through a cousin that my dad had recovered and gone back home. She mentioned that he was furious I hadn't visited him in the hospital, that he felt betrayed all over again. I braced myself for more backlash, but this time it didn't hit as hard. Maybe it was because I was too busy with the move, or maybe I'd finally grown a thicker skin to his criticism. A distant cousin reached out around this time, sharing that she'd gone through something similar with her own parents. She told me about the guilt trips, the manipulation, and how she'd had to distance herself for her own sanity. Hearing her story gave me a sense of validation. It was good to know I wasn't the only one who'd had to make a tough decision like this, and she gave me some perspective on how to stay strong when the family pressure got too much. As I settled into my new place, I started to shift my focus to the future. For the first time, I let myself think about long-term goals. I set up a savings account for an emergency fund and began researching options for going back to school, maybe to get a certification that could help me advance in my new role. I still had student loans to deal with, but I felt like I was finally in a position where I could start planning instead of just surviving. And through it all, I felt this weird sense of relief. Sure, the guilt was still there, lurking in the back of my mind, but without my dad's constant demands, I felt like I could breathe again. I wasn't worried about the next angry text or the next round of family drama. I could focus on my own life without feeling like I was being watched or judged. It's not perfect, and there's still a lot to process, but for the first time in a long time, it feels like I'm living for myself. Update 5. It's been a few months since I posted my last update, and a lot has changed. Looking back, I can't believe how far I've come. When I first put my story out there, I was tangled up in my dad's demands, feeling like I had to defend myself against everyone who thought I was being a bad son. Now, things feel different, calmer even. After my dad recovered from his hospital stay, he went quiet. No texts, no emails, no more trying to contact me through family. For a while, I kept waiting for the next blow-up, expecting him to find some new way to push back into my life. But it never came. It's like he finally accepted that I wasn't going to give in to his demands. Or maybe he's just found a new target for his frustration. Either way, it's been a relief to have that silence. The family drama has settled down, too. Most of my relatives seem to have come to an unspoken truce. A few of them have stayed in touch, but we keep the conversations light, sticking to safe topics and avoiding any mention of my dad. It's not perfect, but at least I'm not constantly on edge, wondering if the next family event will turn into a lecture about how I should be helping him. In therapy, I've had a few breakthroughs. My therapist helped me see that my dad's manipulation wasn't my fault, that I didn't have to carry the weight of his anger and disappointment anymore. We've talked a lot about letting go of the guilt, and I'm starting to believe that it's okay for me to live my own life without feeling like I owe him something. It's not an instant fix. Those thoughts still creep in sometimes, but I'm getting better at pushing them away. I've started picking up new hobbies to fill the space that used to be taken up by all that drama. Hiking has become my go-to escape on the weekends. There's something about being out on a trail, just me and the sound of my footsteps, that clears my head like nothing else. I even bought a cheap camera and started getting into photography. I'm not great at it yet, but there's something satisfying about capturing a sunrise or a quiet lake and knowing that I created something just for myself. One of the best surprises during all of this has been reconnecting with an old friend from high school. He reached out after seeing one of my Reddit posts and invited me to grab a drink and catch up. It was like no time had passed, and suddenly I found myself with a new social circle that I hadn't realized I missed. Hanging out with them has reminded me that there's a life outside of all the chaos with my dad. Meanwhile, things at my new job have been going better than I could have hoped. I've put in a lot of extra effort, and a few weeks ago, my manager pulled me aside to let me know they'd noticed. They're talking about giving me more responsibilities, which could mean a raise down the line. It's been a long time since I felt this confident about my work. It's a nice change from constantly feeling like I'm just scraping by. With my improved finances, I've even started looking for a new apartment. The place I'm in now is fine, but I'm ready for somewhere that feels like more than just a place to crash after work. I've got my eye on a building with better security and a little more space, somewhere I can really make my own. It feels like a fresh start in more ways than one. I've kept in touch with the Reddit community too. They've been there from the beginning, giving advice and sharing their own stories when I needed it most. I try to pay that support forward now, offering advice to people who are dealing with their own difficult family situations. It feels good to give back, and it's helped me feel less alone in everything I've gone through. One night, after another session with my therapist, I sat down and wrote a long letter to my dad. I didn't plan to send it. Honestly, I'll probably never show it to anyone, but it felt like something I needed to do. I wrote about everything, from the good memories we had when I was a kid to all the anger and frustration that built up over the years. I poured out the things I'd never been able to say to his face, and when I finished, it felt like a weight had been lifted. Just when I thought I'd put everything behind me, I got a text from my dad. It was short and out of the blue. He wrote, "I hope you're doing well." That was it. No follow-up, no hidden demand for money, just a simple message. For a long time, I stared at my phone, wondering if I should reply, wondering what he really meant by it. Was this some kind of olive branch, or just another way to get under my skin? In the end, I decided not to reply. I realized that I don't need his validation anymore. I've built a life that I'm proud of, and I don't want to get sucked back into that old cycle of guilt and obligation. Maybe one day I'll be ready for a real conversation with him, but for now, I'm okay with the distance between us. So, I'm closing this chapter with a lot more hope than I started with. I've learned to stand up for myself, found new friends, and started to heal in ways I never thought were possible. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm not as scared of it as I used to be. I'm grateful for everyone who supported me, both in real life and online, and I'm looking forward to whatever comes next. Here's to building a life on my own terms, one step at a time. I grew up believing I was just like any other kid. My parents, Robert and Elaine, were strict but fair, always providing what I needed. We weren't rich, but we lived comfortably in a decent neighborhood. I never questioned my place in the family, never had a reason to. That all changed when I turned 18. It started with something as simple as a university application. I needed a copy of my birth certificate, so I went digging through our home office where all the important documents were kept. I found a folder labeled with my name, and inside was a birth certificate, but the names listed under parents weren't Robert and Elaine. I thought there had been a mistake, maybe a misprint, but as I flipped through the paperwork, I found legal adoption records. My stomach dropped. I stared at the pages, reading and rereading, but the words didn't change. I wasn't their biological son. I was adopted. I walked straight into the living room, holding the papers, and asked them what this meant. Robert was watching TV. Elaine was folding laundry. They barely glanced at me until I placed the documents on the table. The reaction wasn't at all what I expected. Elaine stiffened immediately, her face draining of color. Robert snatched the papers off the table and demanded to know how I had found them. I told them I was just looking for my birth certificate. No one spoke for a long moment, and then Robert let out this deep sigh before tossing the papers back down. "So, now you know," he said, like it was nothing. I asked why they had never told me, why it was a secret. Elaine just shook her head, muttering that it wasn't supposed to come out like this. They refused to answer any of my questions. Every time I pushed for details, they shut down. Elaine eventually left the room, and Robert turned the TV back on, acting like the conversation was already over. That was the moment everything changed. Overnight, their behavior toward me shifted. It wasn't even subtle. One day, I was their son. The next, I was just someone living in their house. The warmth was gone. Elaine stopped asking me about my day, stopped making my favorite meals. Robert barely spoke to me unless necessary. The financial support they had promised for my education, gone without explanation. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself they just needed time. But it didn't stop. It got worse. If I asked for anything, even basic necessities, I'd get a cold stare or a dismissive response. The message was clear. I was no longer their responsibility. 2 months later, I came home from work to find my bags packed by the front door. Elaine was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine like nothing was happening. Robert stood by the door, arms crossed. "You should be grateful we raised you," he said, his tone flat. "But we don't have to keep you." And that was it. No argument, no explanation, no goodbye. I was out. With no money, no safety net, I couch surfed for a while, crashing at friends' places when I could. I picked up whatever jobs I could find, anything to get by. Eventually, I saved up enough to rent a tiny apartment, barely more than a closet, but it was mine. But I needed answers. Why had they adopted me if they didn't even want me? Why throw me away so easily? My birth parents had to know something. I hired a private investigator using what little savings I had left. I expected it to take months, maybe even years. Instead, I got a call 2 weeks later. The PI found them immediately. That should have been my first red flag. I hesitated before reaching out, but eventually, I sent a simple message to the number the PI gave me. I introduced myself, said I had some questions. The response came almost instantly. It was my birth mother, Laura. She was ecstatic. She texted paragraph after paragraph about how she had waited for this moment, how she knew this day would come. Within hours, she and my birth father, Greg, were asking to meet in person. They sent pictures, baby photos of me, ones I had never seen before. It was overwhelming. We met a few days later at a cafe. They were already there when I arrived, sitting side by side in a booth. Laura's eyes were red like she had been crying.
Greg looked nervous but excited. The first thing they said, "Welcome home."
Something about the way they said it unsettled me, like I had been missing, and they had just found me. They told me they had never wanted to give me up, that my adoption had been forced. Laura clutched my hands, tears spilling down her face as she talked about how they had fought to keep me. Greg nodded along, adding that things were complicated back then. It all sounded off. Too rehearsed. Too perfect. Then they started asking questions. Not about me, about my life, my financial situation. Was I in contact with Robert and Elaine? Did I have any inheritance? Was I doing well for myself? I answered cautiously, and each response seemed to shift their energy. They weren't just happy to see me, they were assessing me. A few days later, I got a message from Greg. We never signed away our rights the way they said we did. I didn't know what he meant until I got a knock on my door. It was a process server. Laura and Greg were suing for custody. I stared at the papers, reading and rereading, but the words didn't change. They weren't just asking for a relationship. They wanted full parental rights over me. At 23 years old, at first I thought it was some kind of prank. There was no way this was real. But the legal documents were right there in my hands. Laura and Greg weren't just reaching out for a relationship. They were suing for financial guardianship. They claimed my adoption had been unlawful and were seeking control over any assets tied to my name, arguing that they should have been my rightful financial guardians all along. I met with a lawyer, a guy recommended by a friend who worked in family law. He flipped through the documents and shook his head. It wasn't impossible, he explained. Uncommon, but not impossible. There were loopholes in the law, especially when it came to contested adoptions and financial guardianship. If Laura and Greg could prove my adoption had been illegal or unethical, they could make a case for reinstating their parental rights, meaning they'd have a legal say in my life, finances, and decisions. I had barely processed the shock of it when things started moving fast. The court set a preliminary hearing, and suddenly, I was deep in legal battles with two people I had only met a few weeks ago. They argued that I had been stolen from them. They claimed they had never consented to the adoption, and that Robert and Elaine had somehow manipulated the system to take me. It didn't make sense, but they were pushing it hard. Something about their confidence felt off. People in their situation should have been scrambling to gather proof, but they acted like they already had it. That's when I realized this wasn't the first time they had tried this. I went digging. With my lawyer's help, we requested court records from when I was a child. That's when I found it, an old lawsuit, filed by Laura and Greg against my adoptive parents when I was 5 years old. They had already tried to take me back once, and they lost. The lawsuit back then was thrown out because at the time, they had no legal claim to me. But now, they had a new angle. They weren't fighting Robert and Elaine anymore. They were fighting me. I kept searching. I needed to know why they were doing this now. Then I found out the real reason. They were bankrupt. Laura and Greg had lost a similar lawsuit years ago, attempting to overturn my adoption when I was 5. The court had ruled against them then, and now, desperate for money, they were looking for a new angle, claiming financial mismanagement in my adoption to gain access to my assets. It made perfect sense. If they could gain parental rights, they could gain access to any assets I had. They could file for financial support, even take control of my finances if they convinced the court I was estranged and needed their guidance. I didn't have much, but apparently, I was supposed to have something, because the next bombshell came out of nowhere. My adoptive parents had set up a trust fund for me when I was young, a trust fund that had vanished before I turned 18. I hadn't even known it existed, but my lawyer pulled up the records, and there it was, money that was supposed to be mine, locked away for my future. Except when I turned 18, there was nothing left. Where did it go? Robert and Elaine had drained it. I reached out to them. For the first time since they had kicked me out, I called them, not to make amends, not for their approval. I needed answers. They refused to talk to me, so I pushed forward without them. The court case dragged on and things got ugly. My biological parents turned to the media. They went public with their sob story. They painted me as their stolen child, the son they had searched for all these years, only to be brainwashed against them. They cried on camera, claiming they just wanted their family back. And people bought it. Strangers harassed me online. I started getting messages from people telling me I was an ungrateful brat, that I had broken my real parents' hearts. Some even went as far as to say I owed them a chance. They set up a GoFundMe for their legal battle. It raised thousands. I couldn't believe it. But just when I thought I was completely alone in this, something unexpected happened. I was contacted by a retired social worker who had recently come across my case while organizing old records for a legal archive. She had kept documentation of my adoption process and was willing to testify that Laura and Greg had lost custody due to neglect. She had answers. She told me she had handled my adoption personally, and she still had documents from back then, documents that proved Laura and Greg were lying, and she was willing to testify. I met with her and my lawyer, and what she showed us changed everything. Laura and Greg hadn't been forced to give me up. They had been deemed unfit to parent. There were reports, hospital records, welfare checks, and intervention attempts. They had been investigated for neglect. They weren't victims. They were scammers, and they had been paid to give me up. There was a settlement. They had taken money in exchange for terminating their parental rights. Now, years later, when their money had run dry, they were trying to undo it all. The next court hearing was coming up, and my lawyer was ready, but he warned me, this was far from over. Even with the evidence, even with witnesses, Laura and Greg weren't going to back down easily. They wanted my money. They wanted control, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. I had to be ready, because this case, it could drag on for years. The next court hearing was packed. The media coverage had turned my case into a local sensation, and strangers who had never met me had already decided whose side they were on. My biological parents sat at their table, putting on their best grieving parents act, while my lawyer and I prepared for what was about to happen. Then the social worker took the stand. She was in her 60s now, retired, but she still remembered my case like it was yesterday. She didn't waste time. She had documents, records, and official reports. She confirmed what I had already started piecing together. Laura and Greg didn't lose me because of some conspiracy. They had their parental rights terminated. There had been multiple reports of neglect. She read out the details. As a baby, I had been taken to the hospital for severe dehydration. At 2 years old, I had a broken wrist that no one could explain. Neighbors had reported hearing me cry for hours at a time, left alone while Laura and Greg went out. CPS had intervened 4 separate times. By the time I was 3, the state had given them an ultimatum. Either voluntarily give me up or risk having me forcibly removed. They took the money and walked away. The courtroom was silent. Laura and Greg sat frozen, their expressions shifting from shock to barely concealed panic. Then they tried to fight back. They claimed the social worker was lying, that she was paid to say those things, that the documents were forged. The judge wasn't having it. The moment they accused a government worker of fraud without any evidence, he slammed down his gavel and warned them that lying under oath would lead to severe consequences. That's when their lawyer started backpedaling. Their entire case was unraveling. Then came the next bombshell, the financial records. The evidence showed that Laura and Greg had been taking out loans using my name. Before they even found me, they had taken out tens of thousands of dollars in loans under the claim that they were reuniting with their long-lost son and needed legal funds to correct an illegal adoption. They had banked on winning this case. If they had gotten custody, they would have full access to my finances. If they had lost, they were screwed. And now they were very screwed. The judge demanded an explanation. Greg fumbled through a response, mumbling something about preparing for the costs of fatherhood again. Laura tried crying. It didn't work. Then the prosecution dropped the final piece of evidence, Laura and Greg's criminal records. Multiple arrests, fraud, identity theft, financial scams. They weren't just bad parents, they were career con artists. Suddenly, their whole sob story fell apart, and the people who had been backing them, they turned fast. Social media flipped. The same strangers who had been calling me an ungrateful son were now furious that they had been duped. The GoFundMe that had raised thousands for Laura and Greg's legal fees, people started demanding refunds. Sponsors that had been giving them financial aid backed out immediately. Their lawyer looked done. He had clearly not been told any of this before taking the case. He asked for an emergency recess, probably trying to figure out how to drop them as clients without making himself look bad. Then, as if things couldn't get worse for them, a former friend of Robert and Elaine came forward with one last piece of information. They had made a legal settlement with Laura and Greg when they adopted me, ensuring that my biological parents couldn't interfere in the future. However, Laura and Greg had spent that money long ago and were now trying to backtrack on their agreement. The friend confirmed that when Robert and Elaine adopted me, they knew Laura and Greg were unstable. They wanted to make sure I had a clean break. So they paid them a lump sum on the condition that they never try to contact me again, and they took the money. They had always known where I was. They had just waited until they ran out of cash before coming back. The next hearing was over before it even began. The judge threw out their lawsuit with prejudice, meaning they could never try again. He didn't stop there. He issued a formal warning that if Laura and Greg attempted any more fraud using my name, they would be facing criminal charges. It was over. They had lost. But they weren't done with me yet. The day after the ruling, I got a text. It was from a random number. Please, just give us one last chance. I blocked it. Then they called from another, and another. I changed my number. Then I got an email. We just want to talk. We love you. I deleted it. They had never loved me. They loved what they could take from me. I went no contact with both families. I didn't want to hear from Robert and Elaine either. Even though they had protected me from Laura and Greg, they had still lied to me for 18 years and thrown me away the moment I found out. I was done. Then, just as I was ready to move forward, I got another letter. This one wasn't from my biological parents, or my adoptive parents. It was from a lawyer handling a financial matter in my name. Apparently, my trust fund hadn't disappeared completely. It had been partially drained, but legal restrictions had frozen the remaining amount when Robert and Elaine defaulted on loans linked to it. Now, I was about to find out how much was left. The letter from the lawyer wasn't a scam, it was real. I met with him at his office, expecting to hear that my trust fund had been drained or lost forever. Instead, he gave me something completely different. The fund had never actually disappeared. It had been frozen. My adoptive parents, Robert and Elaine, had petitioned the court to lock the trust fund until I turned 25. Their reason, concerns about financial responsibility. They had lied to me. For years, they let me believe I was broke, let me struggle when there was a six-figure sum sitting there untouched. It wasn't just the money that stung, it was the fact that they had chosen to let me suffer. The lawyer explained that while the trust fund was mine, Robert and Elaine still had partial control as the original trustees. I had two choices: wait until I was 25 or fight to remove them. There was no way I was waiting another 2 years. I reached out to them, not because I wanted a reconciliation, but because I wanted answers. They ignored my calls, so I went to their house. Elaine opened the door, but didn't invite me in. She stood there, arms crossed, eyes cold. When I demanded to know why they had hidden the trust fund from me, she barely blinked. "You don't deserve it." That was all she said before shutting the door in my face. I went straight to my lawyer. We filed a motion to remove them as trustees. They fought back. Robert and Elaine argued that I had been ungrateful, and that they had only been protecting me from reckless spending. They claimed they had planned to give me the money eventually, but after I had betrayed them, they weren't sure I could be trusted. The irony, they had been using my trust fund as collateral for a second mortgage. If I got control of the money, they would be forced to pay back everything immediately. That's why they were fighting so hard. At the court hearing, my lawyer presented the financial records. The judge wasn't impressed. Not only did he rule in my favor, ordering them to relinquish control within 30 days, but he also scolded them for abusing their position as trustees. If they had continued to block access, they could have faced legal consequences. They had lost. When the trust fund was finally unfrozen, I went through the financial documents myself. That's when I saw how deeply in debt Robert and Elaine actually were. They had been drowning for years. When extended family found out what happened, they were horrified. My aunts and uncles, people who had believed Robert and Elaine were loving and responsible, started asking questions, and someone in the family leaked the story to local news. Robert and Elaine's social reputation crumbled. It wasn't just family that turned on them. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues started looking at them differently. They had spent years presenting themselves as good, respectable people. Now everyone knew the truth. Then out of nowhere they reached out, not to apologize, not to make things right. They wanted a loan. They begged, claiming they were about to lose their home, that they had nowhere else to turn. After everything they had done, kicking me out, stealing my money, lying to my face, they wanted me to bail them out. I didn't even hesitate. Hell no, I told them they had made their choice. They had spent years proving they didn't care about me. Now, they could deal with the consequences. I blocked their numbers. That was the last time I ever spoke to them. They had their chance to do right by me. They threw it away. I thought it was over. The lawsuit was thrown out. My trust fund was finally in my hands, and I had cut off both sets of parents. But I underestimated just how desperate Laura and Greg were. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a call from a financial institution. They were confirming approval for a $100,000 loan I had supposedly applied for. I hadn't applied for anything. At first I thought it was a mistake, maybe a scam call. But when I asked for details, the lender pulled up my file, full legal name, social security number, and my trust fund listed as collateral. I knew immediately what had happened. I asked for copies of the application. When they sent it over, my signature was on it. Except it wasn't my signature. Someone had forged my name. It didn't take long to find out who was behind it. The lender provided security footage of the application being submitted in person. Laura and Greg had attempted to take out a fraudulent loan in my name, but the bank flagged inconsistencies in their documentation and contacted me for verification. When I denied any involvement, it became clear they had been trying to forge my identity to access my finances. I wasted no time. I filed a fraud report immediately. My lawyer got involved, and within 24 hours, an investigation was opened. The bank placed a hold on the loan before it could go through, preventing them from stealing a single cent. Then, as if they hadn't already dug their own graves, Laura and Greg tried to reach out. First, it was apologies. They left voicemails, sent emails, begging for me to drop the charges. They said they were just trying to get back on their feet. When that didn't work, they tried threats. They claimed they would go to the media. They would tell everyone that I had actually stolen money from them, that I had manipulated the court and ruined their lives. I sent them one final message before blocking them everywhere. I am not your bank. I am not your bank. I am not your child. Lose my number. A week later, I got the update. They had been arrested. Charges: attempted fraud, identity theft, forgery. With their criminal history, this wasn't going to disappear. Meanwhile, Robert and Elaine found out what happened, and instead of showing any concern, they mocked me. You should have never gone looking for them. Like I had somehow caused this by wanting to know where I came from. Like I was to blame for the fact that both my adoptive and biological parents had tried to use me. For the first time in my life, I had a moment of regret. Not for cutting them off, but for ever trying to find anyone in my family who actually cared. That moment passed quickly. I chose to move forward. I started therapy, focused on securing my finances, and surrounded myself with real friends, people who actually valued me as a person, not as a walking ATM. Laura and Greg tried to fight their case, but their history of fraud worked against them. They were both sentenced to jail time. That was the last thing I ever heard about them. And honestly, that was exactly how I wanted it. It's been a full year since I cut off both sets of parents. A year since I took control of my life, my finances, and my future. And honestly, I have zero regrets. A lot has happened in that time. With full access to my trust fund, I invested wisely, cleared any debts, and made sure I had financial security. I didn't blow it on luxury or revenge spending. I planned ahead. I took courses on financial management, consulted experts, and even started my own business. Nothing flashy, just something steady that I could grow over time. Without toxic family draining me, I finally built a real support system. People who actually cared about me, not for what I could give them, but for who I was. Friends who didn't expect anything except mutual respect. It was strange at first, being around people who didn't have some ulterior motive, but I got used to it. Therapy was another big change. I had spent years trying to earn love that was never real. Therapy helped me realize that the way I was treated wasn't normal, wasn't okay, and most importantly, wasn't my fault. Meanwhile, both sets of parents got exactly what they deserved. Laura and Greg served 6 months in jail for fraud and forgery. When they got out, they had nothing. No money, no home, no sympathy. Their scam had burned every bridge they had left. Robert and Elaine didn't end up in jail, but karma caught up with them in a different way. Turns out they had counted on my trust fund to bail them out of debt. When they lost access to my money, They defaulted on loans and lost their home. They had to sell their cars, downsize, and move in with distant relatives who barely tolerated them. And then after all of that, they still had the audacity to reach out. One day, an envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a long apology letter from Robert and Elaine. At least, that's what it was supposed to be. In reality, it was just a long list of excuses. They blamed stress, bad decisions, financial struggles, everything except themselves. And of course, they ended the letter with a request for help. Just a small loan to get them back on their feet. I laughed, tossed it in the trash, and never thought about it again. As far as I was concerned, they were strangers. If I saw them on the street tomorrow, I wouldn't even acknowledge them. But not everything from my past was meant to be buried. A few months ago, I got a message from someone unexpected, a half-sibling from my biological parents' side. At first, I hesitated. Meeting them felt like opening a door I had already slammed shut. But I didn't want to punish them for Laura and Greg's mistakes, so I agreed to meet. She was 17, nervous but determined. She didn't want money or anything from me, just to talk. That's when she told me something that changed everything. Laura and Greg had abandoned her too. She had grown up bouncing between relatives, always hearing different excuses about why her parents couldn't take care of her. They had never looked for her, never fought for custody, never scammed someone in her name. I wasn't the only child they had failed. Unlike them, she was genuine. We talked for hours, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a connection with actual family, someone who understood exactly what I had gone through. We stayed in touch. We didn't force anything, just let the relationship develop naturally. It was the only real family bond I had ever built. Now, a year later, I finally feel free. Free from my biological parents, free from my adoptive parents, free from the people who failed me. And to make sure I never had to be tied to them again, I did one final thing. I legally changed my name, the name they gave me. Gone. Any trace of them in my life? Erased. I built something better for myself. And this time, no one can take it away from me. Just when I thought my life was completely free from my biological and adoptive parents, they proved me wrong. They had one last desperate play left. And honestly, I should have seen it coming. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a handwritten letter. It was from Laura and Greg. They had finished their jail time and apparently had some things to say. The letter was written in shaky handwriting, full of dramatic phrases about how prison had humbled them and how they had learned their lesson. They went on about being too old to start over, about how much they missed me, and about how I was their last hope. Then came the real reason they were writing. They wanted money. They hoped I could help them financially. Just enough to get back on their feet since they had no one else left. I didn't even hesitate. I threw it away. No response. No second chances. No opportunity for them to weasel their way back in. I should have known that was just round one. Robert and Elaine resurfaced next. After losing their home, they had been bouncing between relatives, but apparently, even their family was sick of them. Then Elaine showed up at my job. I didn't know until a coworker came over and quietly asked if I was expecting an older woman in the lobby, causing a scene. She had walked in unannounced, demanding to see me. I stayed at my desk. Security was called when she refused to leave and started shouting about how I had abandoned my only real family. She made a huge scene. People stared. Phones recorded. Security had to escort her out of the building while she screamed about how I had ruined her life. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A few days later, my lawyer called. Robert and Elaine had filed a legal claim against my trust fund. They argued that since they had raised me for 18 years, they were entitled to financial compensation. They were trying to get a cut of my money. It didn't even make it to court. The judge dismissed it immediately. They had no legal standing, no case, no money, nothing. It was over in minutes. That should have been the end. But Elaine wasn't done embarrassing herself. My cousin texted me. Elaine had taken her pity party to social media. She was posting about me online, calling me a selfish brat who had stolen from them. She made vague posts about how some children turn on the people who raised them and how money changes people. Most of my extended family already knew the truth. The people who didn't, they found out fast. Someone leaked the real story in the comments. How they stole from me, how they kicked me out, how they lost their house because they counted on my money. The sympathy for Elaine and Robert vanished overnight. I only responded once. I posted, "I owed you nothing then, and I owe you nothing now. Enjoy your karma." Then I blocked them everywhere. After that, silence. Weeks passed. No letters, no calls, no surprise visits. They finally gave up. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free. No more guilt trips. No more legal threats. No more manipulation. They had nothing left to take from me. I had spent too much of my life trying to be wanted. Now, I didn't need their approval to be happy. I moved on. I focused on my career, my friendships, and my own happiness. No toxic parents weighing me down. It's been a full year since the last time I heard from either set of parents. No letters, no surprise visits, no social media meltdowns. Just silence.
And honestly,
It's been the best year of my life. Without all the family drama draining me, I was finally able to focus on myself. I invested smartly, built my savings, and for the first time, I felt completely financially secure. My business? Thriving. I no longer lived with the constant fear of someone trying to take advantage of me. The biggest change, though, my half-sister. Over the past year, we built a real relationship. Turns out, she had been treated just as terribly by our biological parents. She had no loyalty to them, no misguided hope that they would change. She saw them for what they were. And when they tried to reach out, this time through her, she shut them down immediately. She didn't even entertain their fake apologies, just blocked them on sight. It was the first time I'd ever had someone in my family truly stand by me. Therapy changed everything. I worked through years of trauma, guilt, and self-doubt. For so long, I had believed I was unworthy of love, that there was something wrong with me, because why else would two separate sets of parents discard me? But the truth, I wasn't the problem. They were, and cutting them off was the best decision I ever made. Meanwhile, Robert and Elaine hit rock bottom. With no access to my trust fund, they had no way to climb out of the financial mess they created. They declared bankruptcy. Robert moved out of state, trying to start over. Elaine, she was living in a distant relative's basement, relying on the very people she had once looked down on. No one felt bad for them. Not anymore. And Laura and Greg, they had one last pathetic attempt at getting money. Since I had completely ignored them, they tried using my half-sister. They reached out to her, acting like the perfect parents. Like they had always loved her, always wanted her. She didn't fall for it. She told them to screw off. She didn't owe them anything. And just like that, they were out of our lives forever. The extended family who had once judged me, they finally understood the truth. They no longer enabled my adoptive parents. No more pity invites or family guilt trips. They cut ties too. No contact feels amazing. For the first time, I don't second-guess myself. I don't wonder if I made the right choice. I did. Cutting them off was the best thing I ever did for myself. Without constant emotional stress, I was finally able to focus on my career. I got a promotion, a massive raise, and for the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. Dating was harder. After everything, learning to trust people again took time. But I met someone who actually supports me. Someone who's been patient while I figure things out. And for once, it feels real. No more looking over my shoulder. No legal battles. No crazy parents. Just peace. If I could tell my younger self one thing, I'd tell him he wasn't the problem. I spent years believing I was unwanted. Turns out, I just had the wrong people in my life. I'm breaking the cycle. I will never be like them. Never. And the future, it looks bright. I've built a real support system. And the best part, none of them share my DNA. Just when I thought I had closed every chapter of this nightmare, I got an unexpected call from a lawyer. He said he was representing an estate that had left me something in a will. At first, I thought it was a scam. I ignored the call, assuming it was some random legal office fishing for business. But when he called back, he mentioned a name I wasn't expecting. My biological grandfather. I had never met him. I didn't even know his name. Laura and Greg had never spoken about him, and I had never bothered to ask. Turns out, he had been estranged from them for decades, and apparently, he had always suspected they were bad people. According to the lawyer, my grandfather had tried to adopt me himself when I was born. When Laura and Greg were already proving they weren't fit to be parents, he had stepped in, but they refused. Instead, they took the easy way out, giving me up for adoption and taking the money instead. Now, after all these years, his will had one final surprise. He left everything to me. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was a property that had been in the family for generations, and with it, a letter. The letter was chilling. My grandfather had written it years ago, long before I ever knew the truth about my adoption. He wrote about how he had fought for me, how he had seen through Laura and Greg's lies. He had known they would never change. He had tried to protect me, but in the end, the system had failed, so he had done the next best thing. He made sure that when the time came, I would have something that was truly mine. Laura and Greg had found out about the will, and they had tried to get their hands on the money. They contested it, arguing that they were his rightful heirs. But the will had been airtight. My grandfather had made sure they got nothing. As for Robert and Elaine, they weren't even mentioned. Not a single word. They never mattered. I signed the papers, took ownership of the house, and sold it for a ridiculous profit. Then, I used the money for something good. I donated part of it to charities that help foster kids and adoptees. I made sure that kids who went through what I did would have resources, support, and a fighting chance. When Laura and Greg found out, they lost their minds. They tried again to contest the will. They failed. Then, out of nowhere, Elaine resurfaced. She tried to play the "I raised you" card. She showed up at my door, begging for something. Not an apology, not a real conversation. She wanted money. I took care of you. I deserve something. She got nothing. I shut the door in her face. There was only one person I wanted to share this inheritance with, my half-sister. I made sure she got a share of the money, enough to build a better life for herself. Unlike our so-called parents, she actually deserved it. For the final time, I did what I should have done years ago. I legally changed my name. No more connection to Laura and Greg. No more ties to Robert and Elaine. No more being linked to people who failed me. I was finally free.